Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And it's my privilege to rise this evening to speak on Bill C-226. And I'd like to thank my colleague and friend, and actually, Mr. Speaker, my seatmate, the Member of Parliament for Bellechasse-les-Châtimènes-Lévis, for his advocacy on this issue. Bill C-226 is the Impaired Driving Act and is really the next evolution of Canada's response to the social problems and tragedies caused by impaired driving across Canada, Mr. Speaker. And being a Member of Parliament and a father from Southern Ontario, I'd like to start off with a few names to show that this is one of the debates in this House that is not a theoretical one. It's one that impacts Canadian lives. Daniel Neville Lake, 9 years old. Harrison Neville Lake, 5 years old. Milagros Neville Lake, 2 years old. And their grandfather, Gary Neville, were killed tragically last year in Southern Ontario in an accident that hit Canadians wherever they were when they heard about a young family taken through the callous act of another Canadian who could have easily avoided the situation he put those young children and their grandfather in. And I don't think there's a member of this House, or indeed anyone in Canada, that watched that court case proceed and the anguish, the parents, particularly the mother of the Neville Lake children, what that entire episode put her through. And we have to remember that bills, like a private member's bill, C-226, can make an impact so that we can look back and say that was the turning point. That tragedy the family suffered through is leading to better policy, better laws, and an updating of Canada's response to impaired driving. And I hope that if we can get 226 through this House, and I implore the government to make sure it gets to committee, that the family can find some degree of solace in the fact that their tragedy is helping other families avoid the same. I read 4 names in this House, Mr. Speaker, but there are thousands of names and families that have been touched by impaired driving, certainly over my lifetime alone, Mr. Speaker. And as a Member of Parliament for Durham, one of the areas in the Durham region, I'm struck by the statistic from the Durham Regional Police Service that tells me 42% of traffic accidents in my region, my area of the country, involve alcohol. 42%, Mr. Speaker. Estimates have suggested that the social cost through accident, through death, through illness, through hospitalizations is $4.5 billion related to a crime perpetrated on victims that could easily be avoided. And why do I say that, Mr. Speaker? We live in an age where this has been socially unacceptable since I got my driver's license at 16. And when I was at Port Perry High School, I remember a motor vehicle on the lawn of the high school, a crashed motor vehicle, a car, on the lawn of our high school, put there by a new group in Canada at that time, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, to bring home to young people the cost of driving after consuming alcohol, Mr. Speaker. So for my generation, indeed most members of this House, this is not socially acceptable, Mr. Speaker, yet it's still a problem we face. We also live in an age where technology and innovation have made it even easier for people to make the right choice with respect to impaired driving, Mr. Speaker. We live in an age where there's not just traditional taxis or the phone call to a mom or a designated driver or dad or a friend. We have Uber, we have ride-sharing, we have programs that are dedicated to avoiding impaired driving, like Keys to Us, where they will follow you back in your vehicle, Mr. Speaker. That didn't exist 30, 40 years ago. There is absolutely no reason for somebody to get behind a wheel impaired today. With social host liability, which has been recognized by the Supreme Court of Canada, there is a zero tolerance now in our country for impaired driving, Mr. Speaker. Yet we still see the horrific accidents and the tragedies they lead to for families like the Neville Lake family. So it's up to this Parliament to react and modernize our laws. And in fact, it was the intention in the last year of the Conservative government to update, modernize these laws, show Parliament's zero tolerance for impaired driving. So I'm very proud of my colleague from Bellechasse-les-Châteauneuf-Lévis for bringing something forward that he knew the last government was working on. How will it work, Mr. Speaker? The most important element, which in some areas is controversial, is the mandatory screening measure. Why is that responsible, Mr. Speaker? Because in nations that have introduced the mandatory screening, like France, like Australia, they've seen a 20% additional reduction in impaired drivers on their roads as a result of the fact that they could encounter a RIDE program, like we know in Ontario, the Reduce Impaired Driving Everywhere program. But in this case, with mandatory screening, the officer would not need to have indicia of impairment, breath, glassy eyes, that sort of thing. And I know the next speaker who's going to speak on the government side, who spent many years in uniform, will maybe know that procedure far more than I do. But the police will be able to say mandatory screening, because if you're on that roadway, that's a responsibility you have. It's not actually a right. We already ask you to pass driver's tests, vision tests. It's a right and a responsibility that you have to not be impaired. So if we can lead to more people not being impaired on our roadways, more accidents being reduced, more tragedies being reduced, why would we not do this? Particularly when a country like Australia or a country like France has had such success with that public policy move, Mr. Speaker. And this is not an invasion of anyone's privacy by any stretch of the imagination. Right now, if you're going too quickly on our motorway, you can be pulled over to the side, Mr. Speaker. If your sticker is dated, if your car is not sound, you can be pulled over for safety reasons by a law enforcement officer. If the driver is not sound, Mr. Speaker, we should have that same right. And mandatory screening will let everyone know that you're not able to be on the road in an impaired state, and there will be a zero tolerance. The other thing Bill C-226 will do will be to toughen sentencing, Mr. Speaker, particularly for repeat offenders. We know that alcoholism is a sickness and that people can get help. So if they can be treated, there should be zero tolerance for them on the streets at all, Mr. Speaker, particularly after their first offence. We should show society's denunciation of that conduct through a tougher sentence. So we will allow courts to have sentences in the 10 to 14-year range and higher in repeat offences causing bodily harm that Canadians expect, Mr. Speaker. We saw what the court determined in the Neville Lake tragedy, Mr. Speaker. We should make sure that courts can do this. We should also speed up, reduce the trauma on victims by not allowing frivolous claims with respect to binge drinking before driving or after an accident. Defences that really are beyond the pale, Mr. Speaker, in this day and age when it comes to this offence. Not allow those sham defences to clog and delay our courts with respect to this offence. And I do think of myself at 43, Mr. Speaker. As I said, I have grown up in an environment where there's been a zero tolerance already for drinking and driving for impaired driving. We now have a government legalizing marijuana, and the risk of further impairment from that drug on young people and people of all ages driving, Mr. Speaker. It's up to this government, and in fact, it's up to the next speaker, Mr. Speaker, to show that our society is also modernizing our impaired driving laws, to show our recommitment to zero tolerance. I know in the Durham region, as I said, the MAD program started when I was in high school. people like Michelle Crabb in the Durham region, whose family was struck, Dave Pereira. These are our volunteers that have been working on the front lines for 40 years. We need to give them the new tools to make sure we have no other families like the Neville Lake family facing tragedy from impaired driving. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.